a disclaimer again?
Sure. I'd like to remind everyone that the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan voter education organization encouraging informed, active participation in government. Tonight's presentation will not necessarily represent League positions, but is part of an educational speaker series of experts informing us about their work and various topics important to democracy.
Thank you. All right, we're getting started. I am Teresa Reed. Welcome, everybody. I'm also a member of the Brews and Views Committee. We are thrilled to have Harvard professor Stephen Levitsky, who's co-author with his colleague Daniel Zilbatt of the international best-selling book, How Democracies Die, which came out in 2018. Here's a quote from the book, late in the book. American democracy depends on us, the citizens of the US. No single political leader can end a democracy. No single leader can rescue one either. A call to action. The book is quite timely. In a nationally representative survey in August of 2019, the nonpartisan research organization Public Agenda found that 81% of respondents, even in 2019, felt that American democracy is either actively in crisis or facing serious challenges. Tonight, we hope to hear from Professor Levitsky what are the most effective steps we ordinary citizens can take to protect our democracy. Quick bio, it's a very brief one for someone with his record. Stephen Levitsky is professor of government at Harvard University. His research interests include political parties, authoritarianism, and democratization, and weak and informal institutions with a focus on Latin America. He's author of several scholarly books on the struggle for democracy in Latin America and the evolution of authoritarianism across the globe. He's currently engaged in research on the durability of revolutionary regimes, the relationship between populism and competitive authoritarianism, problems of party building in contemporary Latin America, and party collapse and its consequences for democracy in Peru. Professor Levitsky? I thought you went away.
I'm on?
Yep, you're good.
We ready to go?
Ready to go.
Okay. Well, first, all right, thanks. Many thanks to the League of Women Voters for the invitation. I wish I could be there in person. But I'm a big fan of your work. And so I'm really pleased to be here. I'm not pleased though that I didn't get a local brew, and I'm completely dry this evening as you guys drink up, but I will try to work that. All right, democracies don't die the way they used to die. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns, military coups, like in Chile in the 1970s. Today, most democracies die in a much more subtle way. They die at the hands not of generals, but of elected leaders, presidents and prime ministers, who often use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. They use elections, they use plebiscites, acts of parliament, Supreme Court rulings. This is Putin, Hugo Chavez, it's Erdogan in Turkey, it's Viktor Orban in Hungary. What's so dangerous about this electoral road to autocracy is that it happens behind a pretty believable facade of democracy. There are no tanks in the streets, elections are still held, the Constitution remains intact, Congress continues to function, and as a result, many citizens don't realize that they're losing their democracy, often until it's too late. Now, Americans took at least a baby step down this road toward electoral autocracy in 2016, when we elected a president with clear authoritarian instincts. This separated him from all of his predecessors, at least in the previous century. This is a guy who had, during the campaign, threatened to lock up his opponent and threatened not to accept the results of an election. But electing a demagogue doesn't necessarily condemn us to democratic breakdown. That is what our institutions are for. Americans have a lot of faith in our institutions, have a lot of faith specifically in the Constitution, and for pretty good reason. We've got the oldest, we have the most successful Constitution on earth. Our Constitution has checked a bunch of pretty ambitious and pretty powerful presidents in the past, from Andrew Jackson to Teddy Roosevelt to FDR to Nixon. But one of the main points in our book is that constitutions by themselves are never enough to protect democracy. Even the most brilliantly designed constitution, and we've got a good one, does not just function automatically. It's got to be reinforced by strong democratic norms or unwritten rules. Our book focuses on two norms in particular, not all norms, but two specific norms. The first one is called mutual toleration. That's very simple. It is accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we disagree with the other side, no matter how much we may personally dislike our rivals on the other side of the aisle, we recognize both privately and publicly that the other guys are loyal citizens who love the country as much as we do and who have an equal and legitimate right to be out there doing politics, to compete in elections, and if they win elections, to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. Second norm is a little more complicated. It's what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of deliberate self-restraint, an underutilization of power. We do not often think about forbearance in politics, but think about what the US president is constitutionally able to do. The president can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president who's got a majority in Congress, you like that one? It's good. Any president who's got a majority in Congress can pack the Supreme Court. So if the president doesn't like the ideological composition of the court, she can pass a law to expand it to 11, expand it to 13, fill it with allies. That is perfectly legal. The Constitution does not prohibit the president from bypassing Congress and making policy through executive orders or by declaring a national emergency. And as we learned pretty recently, or as I learned just a few weeks ago, our laws allow the president to send in the military to crack down on domestic protest. Or think about what the Congress legally, constitutionally can do. Congress can shut down the government by refusing to fund it. The Senate can prevent the president from filling cabinet seats, from filling Supreme Court vacancies, and the House can impeach the president on just about any grounds that it chooses. My point here is that politicians, if they want to, can exploit the letter of the Constitution in ways that eviscerate its spirit. Court packing, partisan impeachment, government shutdowns, national emergencies. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this behavior, using the letter of the law to subvert the spirit of the law, he calls that constitutional hardball. If you look at any failing or any failed democracy around the world, you will find an abundance of exactly this. You'll find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Spain and Germany in the 1930s, Chile in the 1970s, contemporary Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, Turkey. What prevents a democracy, what prevents our democracy from descending into a destructive spiral of constitutional hardball is this thing called forbearance. It is a shared commitment among our politicians to engage in institutional restraint, to not use the letter of the law in order to subvert its spirit. A couple quick examples. Think about presidential term limits historically in the United States. Prior to 1951, the US Constitution placed no limits on presidential re-election. Legally, American leaders could be president for life, just like Hugo Chavez was in Venezuela. But for nearly 150 years, following an informal precedent set by George Washington, no president sought a third term. It was not the Constitution that prevented ambitious presidents like Jefferson, Jackson, Grant from seeking a third term. It was a norm of forbearance, of self-restraint. Another example, take the Senate filibuster historically. Filibusters are a really powerful tool. The opposition can use it to block the president's every move in many cases. But for most of the 20th century, the filibuster was very rarely used. The Senate recorded an average of less than one filibuster a year between 1917 and 1960. Senators exercised forbearance, restraint. These two norms, mutual toleration and forbearance, serve as what Daniel and I call the soft guardrails of democracy. They are what prevent normal, healthy political competition from spiraling into the kind of partisan fight to the death that wrecked democracies in Europe in the 1930s and in South America in the 1960s, 1970s. Now, the United States has not always had these soft guardrails. Didn't have them in the 1790s when partisan warfare between the Federalists and the Republicans nearly destroyed the Republic before it could take root. The guardrails, whatever guardrails we had, collapsed in the run-up to the Civil War, and they remained weak through the era of Reconstruction. The 1860s and the 1870s were replete with constitutional hardball. Changes to the size of the Supreme Court in 1866 and 1869, presidential impeachment in 1868, a contested and maybe stolen election in 1876. Norms of mutual toleration and forbearance really only took hold in this country in the late 19th century. It's worth taking a second to think about why they took root. Mutual toleration really only emerged after the Republicans abandoned Reconstruction and allowed the Democrats to establish Jim Crow in the South. Southern Democrats viewed Reconstruction as an existential threat, and they viewed the proponents of Reconstruction as a lethal enemy. And they fought like hell against it. They used both constitutional hardball and outright violence. It was only after the Republicans agreed to abandon Reconstruction that the two parties began to more or less peacefully coexist. In other words, it was only after racial equality was taken off the agenda and the political community was restricted to whites, it was only then that norms of mutual toleration and forbearance really took hold. Keep that point in mind. Now, that said, norms of mutual toleration and forbearance were pretty strong in the United States throughout the 20th century. Democrats and Republicans, for a good century, accepted one another as legitimate rivals, and for the most part, they avoided destabilizing acts of constitutional hardball. There were no impeachments, no court packing, no costly government shutdowns. Filibusters, as I mentioned, were rare, and Supreme Court nominees were approved even when the opposition party controlled the Senate. So for more than a century, or a little more than a century, our system of checks and balances worked pretty well. But again, the system worked because it was reinforced by norms of mutual toleration and forbearance. What the book argues is that those norms are now unraveling. There were signs of this back in the 1990s when Newt Gingrich encouraged fellow Republicans to use language like betray, anti-flag, and traitor to describe Democrats. He essentially encouraged his fellow Republicans to abandon the language of mutual toleration. Gingrich is also an early master of constitutional hardball. He led the first major government shutdowns of the modern era, and in 1998, his allies in the House carried out the first presidential impeachment in 130 years, arguably on a technicality. But the erosion of mutual toleration really accelerated during the Obama presidency. Republican leaders like Gingrich, Palin, Giuliani, Huckabee, Trump, of course, began to tell their followers, as Obama was running for and after winning the presidency, that President Obama didn't love America, that Obama and the Democrats were not real Americans, and that maybe President Obama wasn't even an American citizen at all. Colorado Congressman Mike Kaufman declared in a fundraiser, and I quote, "I do not know if Barack Obama was born in the United States of America, but I do know this. In his heart, he's not an American. He's just not an American." Congressman. Now, the United States has always had an extremist fringe, but this was no longer fringe politics. This was national Republican leaders beginning to deny the legitimacy of their Democratic rivals. That worries us because when mutual toleration disappears, politicians start to abandon forbearance. When we view our partisan rivals as enemies, when we view our rivals as an existential threat, we grow tempted to use any means necessary to stop them. And that is exactly what has happened over the last decade. After the 2010 Tea Party election, the Republican Congress treated the Obama administration as an existential threat that had to be defeated at any cost. So it played hardball. There were more filibusters during President Obama's second term than in all the years between World War I and Reagan's second term combined. Congress twice shut down the government and at one point pushed the country to the brink of default. President Obama responded with constitutional hardball of his own. When Congress refused to pass immigration reform, refused to pass climate change legislation, Obama circumvented Congress and made policy via executive orders. That action was technically legal, but it clearly violated the spirit of the Constitution. But the most stunning act of constitutional hardball that occurred during the Obama years was the Senate's decision in 2016 not to allow President Obama to fill the Supreme Court vacancy created by Justice Antonin Scalia's death. That move, not allowing the president to fill the Supreme Court vacancy, was unprecedented since 1866. Now, all that stuff I just mentioned happened before Donald Trump was elected president. So the problem is not just that Americans elected a demagogue in 2016. The problem is that we elected a demagogue at a time when the soft guardrails protecting our democracy were coming unmoored. So why the hell is this happening? Our democratic norms are eroding or have been eroding because of extreme polarization. Over the last 25 years or so, Republicans and Democrats have come to fear and loathe one another. Back in 1960, there was a survey, I'm not sure how good a survey it was, it was a survey that found that 4% of Democrats and 5% of Republicans said they would be displeased if their kid married someone from the other party. 4%. Today, that number is nearly 50%. According to a survey from Pew a couple years ago, 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. Another survey found that 60% of Democrats and 60% of Republicans believe the other party is a danger to the United States. We have not seen this level of partisan hatred since Reconstruction. Now, this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization like many of us grew up with. People do not fear and loathe one another this way over taxes or healthcare. They just don't. Today's partisan differences run deeper. They're about racial and cultural identity. Our partisan identities have changed dramatically over the last 50 years, over the course of most of our lifetimes. Back in the 1960s and 1970s, when I was a kid, the Republican and Democratic parties differed on a bunch of issues, but they were culturally and demographically very similar. Both parties were overwhelmingly white and Christian. 3 changes have happened over the last 50 years. First of all, the civil rights movement led to a massive migration of Southern whites from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, while African Americans, in many cases newly enfranchised in the South, became overwhelmingly Democratic. Secondly, the United States experienced a massive wave of immigration over the last 50 years. Most of those immigrants and their kids wound up in the Democratic Party. And third, since Reagan, evangelical Christians have flocked to the Republican Party. Back in the 70s, evangelicals were evenly distributed between the two parties. Now they're overwhelmingly Republican. So today, Democrats and Republicans have the same name, but they represent very, very different communities than they used to. The Democrats are kind of a weird rainbow coalition of urban educated whites and a range of ethnic minorities. Nearly half of the Democratic Party vote today is non-white. The Republicans, by contrast, remain overwhelmingly white and Christian. So what? Why am I making a big deal of white Christians? White Christians are not just any group in the United States. Not only were they once an overwhelming electoral majority, but not long ago, 40, 50 years ago, they occupied the top rung of all of our country's social, economic, political, and cultural hierarchies. They filled the presidency, they filled Congress, the Supreme Court, the governor's mansions, They were the CEOs, they were the newscasters, they were the pillars of local communities. And they were the face of both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Now, those days are over, obviously. But losing a majority, and more importantly, losing one's dominant social status, can be deeply threatening. Many Republican voters, not all, but many Republican voters feel like the country they grew up in is being taken away from them. And for many, that feels like an existential threat. That is what fuels the Republican Party's radicalization in recent years, and that ultimately is what's driving our country's polarization. Problem is, polarization can kill democracy. Research by political scientist Milan Sfolik at Yale shows that the more polarized the society is, the more that we as citizens become willing to tolerate undemocratic behavior on our own side, by our own guys. In other words, when politics is so polarized that we view a victory by our rivals as something that's catastrophic, as something that's intolerable, we start to justify using extraordinary means to prevent them from winning. We start to think about things like voter suppression, election fraud, even violence and coups. Now, Americans haven't, luckily, reached the point of violence and coups, but we have reached a point where, according to exit polls in 2016, 1 out of every 4 Trump voters, 1 out of 4 voters who pulled a lever for Donald Trump said on election day they did not think Trump was fit for the office of the presidency. 1 out of 4 Trump voters did not think the man was fit for office, and yet they still preferred him to the Democrat. We've reached a point where, according to Gallup polls consistently over the last few years, Republicans have a more favorable view of Vladimir Putin than they do Joe Biden. They prefer Putin to Biden. Those are dangerous levels of polarization. Donald Trump is a symptom of that polarization. He did not cause it. Departure from the presidency, whenever that is, will not put an end to it. Now, the Trump administration, I'm not going to talk too much about it, but it has threatened our democracy like no other administration in our lifetime. As you all know, he ordered the violent repression of peaceful protesters. He's condoned on multiple occasions violent behavior by his supporters. He has trampled on congressional oversight. He's sought foreign interventions into our elections. But most importantly, most centrally, and maybe less obviously, Trump has followed the playbook of elected autocrats in places like Russia, Hungary, Turkey, and Venezuela in seeking to corrupt key government agencies and deploy the machinery of government for his own personal, partisan, and sometimes undemocratic ends. So across the US government, officials who are responsible for law enforcement, for intelligence, for national defense, for election security, for public health, even for weather forecasting, are under pressure to work for the president's personal and political benefit. And crucially, they are being pressured to deploy the power of government against the government's critics and against the president's opponents. Those who refuse to go along with that are pushed out and replaced with Trump loyalists. That includes attorney generals, it includes FBI directors, it includes intelligence directors, it includes a bunch of inspectors general who serve as watchdogs against government abuse. This is how autocracies are built. Leaders turn government agencies like the Justice Department, like the FBI, into political weapons, which they use to shield themselves from investigation and to investigate and to punish critics. When the referees work for the incumbent, the playing field, the political playing field, inevitably gets tilted. And that undermines democratic competition. That's what happened in Russia, in Hungary, in Turkey, and it's what the Trump administration is at least attempting to do here. I should add, it's not just Trump. It's the entire Republican Party. When Dan and I wrote How Democracies Die back in 2017, we wrote that we expected that a faction of the Republican Party, particularly in the Senate, would stand up to President Trump if he attempted to violate the law or democratic procedure. Turns out we were too optimistic. Because of Trump's hold on the Republican base, Republican politicians, Republican leaders who confronted him, people like Jeff Flake and Bob Corker, saw their political careers ended, ruined. Unwilling to risk their careers to defend democracy, Republicans in Congress have essentially abdicated their responsibility to oversee the president, which has undermined Congress's role as a check on executive power. Think about last year's impeachment process. Remember that? Remember we had an impeachment? It seems like a long time ago. Senate Republicans made it clear from the outset that they would acquit the president no matter what the evidence. That rendered the institution of impeachment useless as a check on executive abuse. So democratic backsliding is no longer a matter of concerned speculation as it was when Daniel and I first wrote our book. It's now real. Global democracy indices like Freedom House, VDEM, the Economist Intelligence Unit, all show an erosion of American democracy since 2016. According to Freedom House, the United States today is less democratic than Chile, less democratic than the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Taiwan, and Uruguay. And it's in the same tier as newer democracies like Greece, Croatia, Panama, and Mongolia. So where are we headed? I was asked originally to talk about threats to democracy. I want to lay out 3 possible threats to our democracy. The first and most immediate is continued democratic backsliding, and a possible slide into some form of electoral autocracy, like in, say, Hungary. That's a real threat, especially if Trump is reelected. But I want to suggest that a slide into outright autocracy remains pretty unlikely. Our democratic institutions, US democratic institutions, are a lot stronger than those in Russia, Hungary, Turkey, and Venezuela. The courts remain independent. The courts remain quite robust. Federalism, federalist institutions, the states are quite strong, as you guys in Michigan have seen. And within every government agency that the White House has tried to corrupt, committed civil servants have pushed back, often quite vigorously. Civil servants don't always win in the end, but their resistance slows down democratic erosion. So we do continue to have democratic antibodies. Our institutions are, at least to some extent, fighting back. Another key source of democratic resilience is the strength of the opposition. Whereas autocrats like Putin, Orban, Chavez, Erdogan basically steamroll over a weak opposition, the United States has a pretty strong opposition. It's got a well-organized, well-financed, electorally viable opposition. That obviously includes the Democratic Party, but it also includes a wide range of civic and activist groups like Black Lives Matter, which is now spearheading the largest wave of protest in American history. A strong opposition, a robust opposition, makes it harder to consolidate the kind of electoral autocracy that we see in places like Russia, Hungary, and Turkey. But even if we're unlikely to experience a sort of Putin-like slide into autocracy, that does not mean that all is well. I think 2 other threats to democracy, different kinds of threats, are much more imminent, much more likely. One is a slide not into autocracy, but into dysfunction. As I mentioned earlier, a functioning democracy, a working democracy, requires strong democratic norms. Our system of checks and balances only works when there is a minimum of mutual toleration and forbearance. But those norms are being eaten up, destroyed by polarization. And that is rendering our democracy increasingly dysfunctional. When mutual toleration and forbearance disappear, divided government, which we have today, turns into a kind of permanent institutional warfare. Politicians turn institutions into partisan weapons, exploiting whatever legal authority they have to try to thwart their rivals. That's a world of stolen Supreme Court seats, of partisan impeachments, of government shutdowns, of declarations of national emergency. But a little over a year ago, Daniel and I met with a group of US senators And one of them told us, one of them who had an unsuccessful presidential bid, I know that doesn't narrow the field down very much, but one of the senators told us that he thinks, now I've narrowed it a little bit more, he thinks that we will never again see a successful Supreme Court nomination when the president's party doesn't control the Senate. In other words, Merrick Garland is about to become the rule, not the exception. Or take impeachment. Donald Trump is exactly the kind of leader that impeachment was designed to protect against. He exploits the power of his office for personal gain. He flouts congressional authority and the rule of law. He tried to use law enforcement agencies to investigate and punish critics. And the Ukraine case, and now we've heard China as well, revealed that Trump was willing to abuse the power of the presidency to undermine the integrity of the 2020 election. That's pretty impeachable stuff. But our politics is so polarized that for Senate Republicans, beating the Democrats continued to be more important than reining in executive abuse. In other words, polarization has rendered the institution of impeachment totally dysfunctional. Doesn't work. This is a dangerous and debilitating level of dysfunction. We are sliding into a world of constant institutional crisis, a world of government shutdowns, impeachments, of stolen Supreme Court seats, of fabricated national emergencies, and maybe even contested elections. Remember Florida 2000? There are probably many of those to come. Now, this slide into dysfunction may not seem as bad as a slide into Putin-like autocracy, but it's got really important consequences. First of all, it prevents our governments from dealing or responding to the most important problems facing our society, from pandemics to climate change. And second, and more directly related to democracy, dysfunction is eroding public confidence in our democratic system. When governments consistently fail to respond to citizens' most pressing needs, citizens eventually, even American citizens, eventually lose faith in the system. And that's happening in America today. According to a recent study, the percentage of Americans who say they are dissatisfied with our democracy has risen from less than 25% in 2000 to 55% today. When societies lose confidence, when a majority of citizens loses confidence that democracy can resolve their problems, they grow vulnerable to the appeals of demagogues who promise to get things done by other more autocratic. So dysfunction is one threat. The other threat that we face today is a slide into what is essentially minority rule. As all of you know, I'm sure, our electoral system is designed to favor sparsely populated territories. So the Electoral College is biased towards sparsely populated states. The Senate is heavily biased towards sparsely populated states. And because the Senate approves Supreme Court nominations, the Supreme Court is at least somewhat biased towards sparsely populated states. Now, for the first 200 years of American history, that kind of sucked for New York and it was good for Wyoming, but it didn't really have a partisan effect because both parties for the first 200 years had urban wings and rural wings. So it didn't really matter, at least for partisan competition, that the system favored sparsely populated. It is only in the last generation that our parties have split along urban-rural lines. So today, the Democrats are overwhelmingly based in big metropolitan areas, like Boston, where I live, while the Republicans are overwhelmingly based in sparsely populated territories. That means that through no fault of their own, the Republicans now have a systematic advantage in the Electoral College, in the Senate, and that opens up the possibility of minority rule. Consider the following. The last two Republican presidents won the White House despite having lost the popular vote. That could easily happen again in 2020. The Democrats overwhelmingly won the popular vote. They won more votes nationally for the Senate in 2016 and 2018, and yet Republicans still control the Senate. In 2017, Neil Gorsuch became the first Supreme Court justice in the history of the United States to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. A year later, Brett Kavanaugh became the second Supreme Court justice in U.S. history to be appointed by a president who lost the popular vote and then be confirmed by senators who represented less than half the country. That's pretty undemocratic. Now, the Republicans did not create this counter-majoritarian system, but we worry that they may use it to entrench themselves in power. We just saw an example of this with the Ukraine scandal. The president abused power to undermine his rival in the 2020 presidential election, but the Senate, a counter-majoritarian institution, let him get away with it. The 52 senators who voted to acquit Trump represented 18 million fewer voters, fewer Americans, than the 48 senators who voted to remove Trump. Another example, Republicans across the country are engaged in efforts to disenfranchise low-income and minority voters. They're making it harder for people to register and to vote. Those efforts are often being challenged in the courts, but the Supreme Court, another counter-majoritarian institution, is likely to uphold almost all of these efforts. So we could be in for a period of minority rule, a period in which governments elected by a minority of Americans seek to tilt the playing field against the majority with the protection of two pretty powerful counter-majoritarian institutions, with the protection of the Senate and with the protection of the Supreme Court. All right, so what can be done? That's what I was asked to talk about. First of all, and most centrally, and actually this is a source of optimism for me, most importantly, the Republican Party has to change. The Republican Party has to become a more diverse political party. As long as the Republicans remain an overwhelmingly white Christian party in a society as diverse as ours, they will be almost inevitably prone to extremist and anti-democratic behavior. This is an important point, so let me develop it for a minute. Democracy requires that parties know how to lose. That means that when we lose an election, we accept defeat, we go home, maybe get drunk, regroup, get ready to play again the next day. That's how democracy works. But for parties to lose graciously and accepting defeat and going home and getting drunk and getting up the next day to play again, that's the norm of losing graciously. For parties to lose graciously, two conditions must hold. First of all, parties have to believe that they have a chance of winning again the next day. They have to believe they have a chance of winning again in the future. And second, parties have to believe that losing will not bring ruinous consequences. When politicians fear that they're not going to be able to win in the future, or if they believe that losing today will bring catastrophe, the stakes suddenly rise. Politicians' time horizons shrink, they throw tomorrow to the wind, and they try to win at any cost today. In other words, desperation, fear of losing leads politicians to play dirty. Now, my co-author, Daniel, who's actually the smart one, I'm sorry, he's in Germany. Daniel found this dynamic in his research on 19th century Germany. German conservatives in the latter part of the 19th century were terrified by the prospect of universal suffrage. For them, giving the working class the right to vote meant not only that the right was probably going to lose elections, but the entire aristocratic order would possibly collapse. Faced with that threat, conservatives played dirty. They used fraud and repression to hold on to power all the way up into World War I. Closer to home, think about Southern Democrats after the Civil War. Reconstruction and the 15th Amendment brought widespread Black enfranchisement across the U.S. South. African Americans constituted a majority or a near majority in most post-Confederate Southern states. So the enfranchisement of African Americans scared the bejesus out of Southern Democrats and out of their supporters. Not only did Black suffrage threaten the Democrats' electoral dominance, but it threatened to overturn the entire racial order. Facing what they perceived to be an existential threat, the Democrats played dirty. Between 1885 and 1908, all 11 post-Confederate states passed laws that used poll taxes, literacy tests, property and residency requirements to effectively eliminate African Americans' right to vote. Black turnout in the South fell from 61% in 1880 to just 2% in 1912. Unwilling to lose, Democrats stripped the right to vote from nearly half the population in the South, ushering in nearly a century of authoritarian rule in the Southern states. We fear that something similar is happening today in the Republican Party. The Republicans' medium-term electoral prospects are pretty bleak. Again, the Republicans are an overwhelmingly white Christian party, but white Christians are a declining share of the American electorate. 1992, when Bill Clinton was elected president, not that long ago, I remember this. When Bill Clinton was elected, white Christians were 73% of the US electorate. In 2012, Obama's re-election, white Christians were down to 57% of the electorate. By 2024, when Ivanka or Don Jr. are running for president, white Christians will be down to less than 50% of the electorate. Now, to make matters worse for Republicans, younger voters, it turns out, are overwhelmingly Democratic. In 2018, the last midterm elections, people aged 18 to 29 voted Democrat by a more than 2-to-1 margin, and 30-somethings voted something like 60% Democrat. And the old idea that you become more Republican as you get older is mostly not true. You get a little less radical, but the research shows that people hold on to the partisan identity that they take on during their formative years, during their late teens and college. So this is the fact that young people are overwhelmingly not Republican is a bad sign for the Republicans looking forward. But the problem is not just that Republicans face a bleak electoral future. The problem is that the Republican base has come to view defeat as something that's catastrophic. As I noted earlier, many Republican voters fear they're on the brink not just of losing elections, but of losing their way of life, of losing their country. The very idea of a white Christian America seems to be slipping away. Slogans like "Take our country back," "Make America great again," reflect that sense of peril. So like the old Southern Democrats, Republicans have begun to play dirty. In state after state after state, Republican governments are taking steps to make it harder, particularly for lower income and minority voters, to register and to vote. They're closing polling places in predominantly African American neighborhoods. They're purging voter rolls. They're making it harder to register. Since 2010, more than a dozen Republican-controlled states have adopted strict voter ID laws aimed at dampening turnout among poorer and non-white voters. Georgia Republicans used egregious voter suppression tactics in the 2018 gubernatorial race, including a Jim Crow-style exact match law that allowed state officials to throw out any voter registration form whose information was not an exact match with other state records. So if I apply for a driver's license and I put my name as Stephen R. Levitsky, my middle name, and then I forget to put my middle initial in the voter registration form, and toss it out. Last year, Texas Republicans tried to purge the voter rolls of nearly 100,000 Latino voters. And this year, Republicans in Texas are refusing to treat COVID-19 as a valid excuse to obtain an absentee ballot. So if you're afraid of getting sick, you just don't vote. So this is not just Trump. Republicans across the country are starting to play dirty. The only way out of this mess is for Republicans to become a more diverse party. Once the Republicans learn how to compete for urban, secular, non-white voters, they'll become much more confident about winning elections and much less fearful of a multiracial America. When that happens, when Republicans learn to compete in a multiracial America, they should de-radicalize, and our politics should depolarize. When will that happen? It'll happen when Republicans lose elections. Parties change when their strategies fail. So Republicans can be expected to change course if and when they receive probably a series of electoral shellackings. So the question is, what should Democrats do in the meantime? One idea that's gained a fair amount of traction in recent years in some progressive circles is that Democrats need to start playing dirty. If Republicans are going to play constitutional hardball, the argument goes, the Democrats need to play tit for tat, using forbearance, using restraint, while the other guys are playing hardball is like going into a boxing ring with a hand tied behind your back. So Democrats, the argument goes, need to learn how to fight like Republicans. They need to do things like shut down the government and pack the Supreme Court and steal Supreme Court seats. Daniel and I think that would be a terrible mistake. A tit-for-tat strategy of Democrats fighting like Republicans would inevitably lead to escalation, which would accelerate the politicization of our institutions and accelerate the erosion of our democratic norms. Once the spiral of escalating constitutional hardball begins, it gets very, very difficult to reverse. If you look at other countries, from Spain in the 1930s to Chile in the 1970s to Turkey and Venezuela in the 2000s, this sort of escalation very rarely ends well. Keep in mind, at least if you're a Democrat, that the Democrats' medium-term election prospects are pretty good. The Democratic electorate is younger, it is growing. In fact, the greatest threat to Democrats' medium-term political prospects is an escalating conflict that puts our institutions at risk, one that either destroys our democracy or leaves it utterly dysfunctional. If Democrats start to fight like Republicans, they will be hurling themselves down that very path. What Democrats, and I mean small d Democrats, can do and should do is fight for democratic reform. The best way to combat minority rule is to double down on democracy, to defend and to expand the right to vote. That means pushing for measures that make it easier, that encourage people to register and to vote. Automatic registration, easier access to polling places, make Election Day a holiday, fully restore the Voting Rights Act. And during this pandemic, God knows, provide all Americans with the option to vote by mail. The best way to defend our democracy today is to ensure that all Americans can vote, have an equal ability to vote. The United States is in the middle of an immense, immense political earthquake. We have begun a transition that, to my knowledge, no democracy ever has successfully undergone. We've begun a transition in which a previously dominant ethnic group loses its majority. I'm pretty confident that we'll be the first democracy to make that transition, that we will, in fact, get to the other side. But to get there, we're going to have to pass through a period of intense and polarizing reaction. That's where we are now. During this period of intense and polarizing reaction, Americans cannot afford to be reckless with our institutions. We need to protect our institutions. We have far, far too much to lose. I've talked too much, so I'll stop there. Thank you. I can't hear anything.
I'm sorry, am I unmuted now?
Yeah, now you're unmuted.
Oh my goodness, I said thank you. Thank you for your talk, and thank you for ending on a somewhat hopeful note. Really appreciate that. We have a lot of questions, some of them from earlier and some of them coming in right now, and some of them from me. So let's just get started. In the book, you and Dan warn about how authoritarians seize on crises to consolidate their power. We're facing three crises right now: an uncontrolled pandemic, uncontrolled economic inequality, and the new salience of systemic racism in both state violence against Blacks and other people of color, and in heightened susceptibility of these groups to death by pandemic and poverty. So is this the kind of crisis that aspiring authoritarians can use to increase their power? And if so, what are the main safeguards for us now against the consolidation of their power?
Great question. So in general, yes, crises, particularly security crises that make people, everybody, that make every citizen feel afraid and turn to the government because they're afraid. That type of crisis is a great opportunity for authoritarians to concentrate power. And historically, whether it's the Reichstag fire in Germany or the supposed Chechen bombings of Moscow in Russia, it's very often crises, usually security threats, terrorist attacks, wars, things like that, that allow potential autocrats to seize power. The COVID-19 crisis, so I think of the crises you mentioned, there's sort of one and a quarter offer the possibility of power. If there were large-scale violence or riots, which actually have largely evaporated after the first couple of days here in the police violence protests, but large-scale violence and large-scale rioting might provide that kind of crisis. And I think a pandemic certainly creates the opportunity for an autocratic leader to seize power. We've seen it in a few countries. We saw it, I think, most spectacularly in Hungary. Essentially, Orban declared a dictatorship in response to the pandemic. In El Salvador, we've seen this a bit, in the Philippines and in India. But in other countries, no. And luckily, in the United States, Trump did not seize upon the crisis to seize power. He actually did the opposite. He kind of abdicated responsibility. So in another world, he might have stepped up and say, we've got this huge crisis. I'm going to, engage, declare a state of emergency, spend trillions of dollars on combating the crisis, and really sort of use this as a populist moment to accumulate power. He basically ran away from the problem. He was terrified of frightening the stock markets. He was thinking about re-election and wanting to get the economy going, and he was kind of living in a fantasy world that COVID would kind of go. So because of his response has been awful, just awful for public health in this country. And tens of thousands of lives are being lost as a result. But in terms of protecting democracy, his kind of hands-off strategy and kind of hiding under the table has been less harmful. So potential autocrats don't always respond to crises by concentrating power. And in fact, in the United States, and I would say in Brazil too, Bolsonaro, presidents' really poor responses to the pandemic have actually weakened them rather than strengthened them. So democracy is probably safer. America is not safer than it was 6 months ago, but our democratic institutions just might be.
Okay, well, that's hopeful. Thank you. Thinking about like a resurgence in the fall, it strikes me that that this isn't a security threat like from outside. People can't see it as a security threat from outside, so there's not the same inclination to rally around a leader. So, and in fact, if we get another resurgence in the fall, it's likely to be blamed on the inadequacies of the current administration. So maybe we wouldn't have the same ability to grab for authoritarian controls.
Yeah, interestingly, in other countries and in many US states, including Michigan, there has been a rally around the leader effect where governors or presidents or prime ministers from Germany to New Zealand to Peru to Chile and to Argentina, where governments have responded vigorously to the crisis, people have rewarded them. They've gained a lot of support. So there has been a rally around the leader effect. It just hasn't happened to Trump. Trump got like a 4-point bump that pretty quickly evaporated.
Right. Okay, good. So You mentioned getting mired in minority rule, or getting into a period of minority rule because of the electoral college and just the built-in structural advantages for rural voters, largely. Once you get mired in minority rule, how do we get out? I mean, that's scary.
It's a good question. Certainly, those who benefit from our institutions will never consent or are unlikely to consent to reforming them.
Right.
So you can imagine the United States is the only major presidential democracy left with an electoral college. There are all kinds of reasons for getting rid of the electoral college. The Argentines in the 19th century copied our Constitution. They almost plagiarized the US Constitution back in 1853. They adopted an electoral college, but by 1994, they tired of it, they got rid of it. But we still have our electoral college. One could imagine, it's easy to imagine a good argument for eliminating the electoral college, but the Republicans benefit from it. So they have no reason at all to accept a constitutional reform, eliminating it.
Exactly.
I think demographic change is what will eventually overcome minority rule. It is entirely possible for a party based on rural voters to win consistently despite losing the popular vote. But eventually, all of the population trends are working against that. As I said, the country is becoming more diverse. The rural white voters are a smaller and smaller share of the electorate. And crucially, younger voters, even in red states, younger voters are becoming less enamored with the Republican Party. So it's a strategy that can work for a while. I can't possibly sort of predict how long it could work, but I think eventually demographics will overwhelm it.
But it might be a generation.
Yeah, and I think that we could do a lot of damage. So what's going to happen? I mean, younger urban voters, call them, Bernie Sanders supporters, are already pretty disenchanted with our system, right?
Yeah.
Good reason, right? If you are a millennial voter, you grew up in a world of the lies in the Iraq War, of the financial crisis in which we bailed out banks but not people, of the Trump presidency. There's not much to trust in our leader. Unlike old people like me who remember an era where things kind of worked, younger voters don't have much faith in the system.
Yeah.
And a growing number of younger voters who are pushing the Democratic Party to the left, for better or worse, who are really very anti-establishment, right? That's where it comes from. How are those voters going to respond to multiple elections where the minority candidate, minority meaning the one with the fewer votes, wins the presidency? How are they going to respond to their clear majority being systematically denied power? They're already losing faith in the system. I think they grow further disenchanted, further radicalized.
They're going to have to get seriously disengaged in the electoral process, maybe more so than they are right now, in order for it to really change. Sounds like.
We'll see. I think it's the best thing to do is equip our citizens to vote and avoid a slide into minority rule in the first place.
Well, and let's talk about that. So what do you think are the maybe 2 or 3 greatest threats to American democracy in this election year?
Look,
another number.
Anytime you elect a president who is not committed to democratic practice and to basic democratic rights and the rule of law, you threaten your own democracy. Now, we may well have the strength in our institutions, in our society, to defend ourselves from that, but anytime there is a real qualitative difference between Donald Trump on the one hand and everybody from Jimmy Carter to George Bush the father to George Bush the son to Bill Clinton to Ronald Reagan, who you may or may not like their policies, you may or may not like them as individuals, but they were basically committed to democratic rules of the game. You didn't have to worry they wouldn't leave the White House if they lost the election.
Right.
This one is different. And so the imminent threat is that we've got a president who is clearly willing to play dirty to win. That's one. The other threat is, and this is only partially to do with Trump, is I think there's a decent chance of a train wreck election in a couple of senses. First of all, I mean, unless Trump continues to fall the way he has in the last few weeks, we're probably headed towards a very close election. An election that is, again, much like recent elections, basically a tie, right? We could have an election that is defined by 2 or 3 states like Wisconsin or Florida, that in which the election is really close. It's a tie, maybe within the margin of a recount, and maybe the two parties disagree on the procedures for a recount. 2000 wasn't that long ago. Think about Florida 2000. Today, the parties are much more polarized than they were in 2000. And today, if the Supreme Court were to step in and say, rule in Trump's favor, first of all, we don't have an Al Gore. And
Right.
second of all, the Supreme Court has much less legitimacy than it had in 2000. So given that we could very well have a tie election that is sort of too close to call, that goes to recounts in 1, 2, or 3 states, and given that Donald Trump is the anti-Al Gore, right? He will claim fraud even when there isn't fraud. And he won't accept the election even if it's clean. This does not mean he's going to be able to hang on to the presidency for another term, but there could be a heck of a crisis. Could be a prolonged crisis. Could be something like 1876, where we weren't for many months. I think that the chances of an electoral crisis, of just an election that's so close and so disputed that we don't agree on who the winner is, there's a real possibility of that. And I think the pandemic makes it much worse.
Right.
We've already seen it in Wisconsin and in Georgia. If any place that suffers a surge of the coronavirus in the fall, and this is quite possible, I can't predict, but it could quite possible. The people who traditionally work as volunteers in the polling places, who are often retirees, are not going to want to work for good reason. Many voters are going to want to vote by mail. Now, in many states, including Michigan, that's already been the state government has responded very effectively. There are other states where not. In Texas, for example, a big and important state, you have to have a valid excuse to get an absentee ballot. And the Republicans decided that COVID-19 is not a valid excuse.
Yeah.
Being 80 years old and fearing getting sick, standing in line, is not a valid excuse. And so we could, if the situation is bad enough, we could have a situation, at least in some pockets, where there's chaos, not enough election workers,
Right.
and where turnout plummets because people are afraid to vote.
Right. We're also confronted with the attack on the USPS and the Postal Service.
Right.
I mean, today as of today, it isn't funded past September 30th.
Right.
And a very strident partisan has taken over running the Postal Service. So that's another factor that could really, really, really spell terrible trouble.
This is a phenomenon that Daniel and I call malign neglect. I mean, we know, looking ahead 5 months from now, that there are a bunch of steps that we can take to make this a safe election, right? We can take a bunch of steps, and this involves, it may involve mobilizing the National Guard to work as volunteers in the polling places. It certainly involves funding and equipping the post office to deal with a surge in absentee ballots. There are steps that we can take. It takes money, it takes planning, it takes effort. And in my view, the government, the federal government, not state government, but the federal government is actively resisting these efforts because it prefers a chaotic, low turnout election to an election in which everyone can vote. If Trump's behind the polls, one thing we know about Trump is he's a guy who likes to throw the dice, to roll the dice. And I think for him, rolling the dice with a chaotic, low turnout election is preferable if he's behind. And
Yeah.
he's basically not self-consciously not taking the steps we need to hold a secure, safe election because a chaotic, low turnout election might benefit him.
It's disturbing that he's backed up by the Attorney General of the United States. I was going to ask you something else about the Postal Service. Oh, I was just going to comment that it's, there's bipartisan, something like bipartisan consensus that mail-in voting is a good idea, and bipartisan support for it. So that may still work out. We may still find bipartisan.
It has, thankfully, in many, many states, including Michigan.
Yeah,
Right. That have with bipartisan support. Even Wisconsin now has gone around and taken important steps towards ensuring a fair and safe election. So, yeah, there's reasons for hope, but there's also, we're not accustomed to losing sleep over the integrity of our elections, right? We're used to going and taking for granted that our electoral process will be free and fair. But that's no longer the case. There's a lot to worry about.
It's tremendous anxiety, just tremendous anxiety, and everybody that I know. I have a couple of happier questions, kind of. If Biden,
do you want to brew? That's the question.
That's coming up in about 10 minutes here. If Biden wins in 2020, or maybe I should say when, but if Biden wins in 2020 and doesn't have a Senate majority, what are the 3 or 4 most important steps he can take to support our democracy, to repair our democracy? He wins, but he does not have a Senate majority.
Look, my fear is that if Biden wins and doesn't have a Senate majority, we'll be sliding back, we'll be in the world of dysfunction. That it'll be a lot like the Obama president, the second half of the Obama presidency, where the Senate is used to block just about everything, including perhaps Supreme Court appointments. So it could be I know Biden is confident, or at least projects confidence, that he can somehow bring us back to an earlier era where he can sit down with Mitch McConnell and work things out. I'm skeptical of that. So I think we're headed for a lot of gridlock and a lot of frustration if Biden doesn't win the Senate. He can do a bunch of things, though. He can begin to put out the government agencies that Trump has taken steps toward corrupting. He can put them back on their feet. He can staff them with professionals. This involves forbearance, right? He could do what Trump did, right? He could pack the everything from the FBI to the intelligence agencies to the Attorney General's office with hacks who do his bidding, who do his partisan and personal bidding. But what he should do, and what he could do to strengthen democracy, is put in place highly respected professionals whose independence and integrity are unquestioned, and go back, take steps to rebuilding the integrity and the legitimacy of our key institutions. And that's really important. That involves not taking partisan advantage. It means to some degree Biden tying his own hands. But he would have to go back and sort of play by Democratic norms. So respond to congressional oversight, right? Don't thumb your at congressional oversight. Play by the rules and the norms. Again, that would limit his effectiveness. It means he'll get less done. It means he'll get rolled several times by Mitch McConnell. There are costs to this. Progressives are going to flip out, but it's the best thing he could do for our democracy.
Okay, so uphold the norms, even if it's costly for us.
Right, absolutely.
For the democracy in some ways. So say he wins and does have a Senate majority. What are the 3 or 4 things he can do to protect and restore our democracy?
Well, here I'm going to say something that is a little more controversial, but I think the Democrats should eliminate the filibuster. The filibuster, as I mentioned in the talk, is an institution that only works with forbearance. If it's something that if you break the glass and use it once a year, as was the case between 1917 and 1960, then okay, it can work. But now the filibuster is used with every piece of legislation. So you don't have majority rule in the Senate. You need 60 votes to get anything through the Senate. And that is causing, in our polarized context, just too much dysfunction. And so an important step away from minority rule, given that the filibuster is already broken down, that the norm sustaining the filibuster has eroded and collapsed years ago, the filibuster ought to be eliminated and the Senate ought to become a majoritarian institution. That would, I think, be positive for democracy. It would also obviously allow Biden to get more of his agenda through.
Great. Okay, so I'm excited reading about your the work around the fact that it's our multi-ethnic, multiracial democracy that is so extremely difficult, and that we'd be the only democracy in the world who succeeded as a democracy with a multi-ethnic population. I think that's really exciting. I'm curious about your thoughts about you mentioned that Newt Gingrich, back in the 90s, really started putting the gas on polarization and demonization of the opponents, of Democrats. But boy, that really, after Obama, and in fact, even before Obama, with the savage, completely disrespectful questioning of his legitimacy, that felt and feels even more so now really racially based. I mean, his race added gasoline to the fire. So it seems to me just like an extension of the attack on Reconstruction and voting rights in the South. Is that, do you read it that way?
I'm sorry, I'll let you finish. Go ahead.
Would you read it that way?
Yes, but I think you can sort of see it as a glass half full and half empty. There's no question, every time that we have taken steps toward racial equality in this country, it has triggered a reaction. It's triggered a backlash. It's often been violent, and sometimes it's had really negative authoritarian consequences, from the destruction of Reconstruction to the reaction against the civil rights movement to what we're seeing now. There's no question that Donald Trump is in part a reaction to having had an African-American president. All of that said, the progress continues, and the intensity of the reaction and the hatred of the hatred that one sees in the reaction is a sign that we're making real progress. And nowhere is this clearer than in the streets today. Unlike any other protest in American history, these protests are thoroughly multiracial. They are thoroughly multiracial. They are the most multiracial. It's the most multiracial social movement we've ever had in American history, and it's a sign of a new coalition that's emerging. The divide in the United States today. This is kind of odd, but the divide in the United States today is no longer between whites and non-whites. It's actually within the white community, because a big chunk of the white community, for the first time ever, is on board with an agenda of racial equality. Not everyone, not entirely, but there is much greater white support for real civil rights action, for steps towards real racial equality than ever before. Mm-hmm. That's rising for a while, but it's accelerated under Trump. So it's bad, we worry about all these incredibly negative consequences of the Trump presidency, racist attacks going up, racists being emboldened, all that is true. But public opinion surveys show that basically white progressives have become much more progressive on issues of race than ever before. It's sort of like people, those whites who are not for Trump, hate Trump so much that in reaction to him and his racism, they're becoming more anti-racist.
Yeah.
We're seeing the emergence of a multiracial coalition that I think will take our democracy into the next century.
That's really exciting. You said it was the biggest or the first time in the history of the country to see such a diverse activist coalition. It's probably the first time in the history of the world.
Maybe. I can't say. I don't know enough to say.
That's exciting. It's an exciting, happy development, I think. Just thinking about that can get me through the next few months, I hope. Rena, are there questions in the chat that you want to jump in with? I think Cheryl had one.
I think that they have been hit.
They've been answered. Okay.
People are really concerned. Don't we still need fair election legislative laws to protect the vote, such as early voting and no reason? And yes, we talked about that. There was a concern that the growing inequality of wealth is also a piece of this minority rule or political power. And I think that's been touched on. Some questions about China. Yeah, I think, again, folks, if you want to sneak in a last minute question, although we're almost out of time, type it in all caps.
We're almost out of time. And I want to close with, you know, what I loved reading in your book and what you just said was how vital civic institutions are as a bulwark against authoritarianism. And of course, the League of Women Voters, 100 years old this year, is so powerful and such an enduring and hopeful civic institution. So I'm very proud to be part of it. Give us 3 steps we, not just the League, but just concerned citizens in this multiracial coalition, 3 things that we can do to protect our democracy.
First of all, I agree entirely with you that our civic institutions, our associations, and particular groups like yours that have been working on issues of voting rights and free and fair elections for decades and decades, you absolutely are the bulwark of our democracy. And I cannot tell you how much I applaud you guys. You know, I think we've touched on the core issues, and it's so great that you guys were working on this stuff. Somebody just chatted that they can't hear. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. The integrity of our elections and voting rights are the principal issue today. So in 2020, it's about safe access to the ballot. The immediate concern is making sure everybody can safely vote in 2020. After 2020, the agenda is related but expands. It's about fighting off these efforts to make it harder to register and vote, and taking steps, reforming our voting system so that we get closer to universal registration and voting. And so that's an incredibly important agenda. I would add to that you know, we have without question a timely reinvigoration of the civil rights movement in this country, and reforming the police and reforming the justice system. We have much greater racial equality today than we had in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. There's no question about that. Yeah. But there are really important pockets of racial inequality, institutionalized racial inequality that need to be reformed. And the justice system and the police are at the center of that.
Yeah.
So supporting efforts of criminal justice reform and supporting efforts to curb and hopefully eliminate police violence of all kinds is another central. I mean, you know, people on the streets have made it an agenda item. It's not going to go away. And I think that's also really important, not only for civil rights, but it's an important issue for cementing that new multiracial coalition we were talking about.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And I'll just add one last thing, and that is that our first African-American president is also currently the most popular politician in the country. So that's really good. That's really good news.
He's a good politician. He also doesn't have too much competition right now. But
oh gosh, take it down, Steve. Okay. Okay, thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and your expertise and your good spirits and everything.
It was a great pleasure to be here, and I'll look forward to that beer coming in the mail.
That's right.
Yeah.
We'll get that in the mail soon. I'm gonna thank everybody. I'm gonna also mention that our next Brews and Views will be on July 17th. And the topic will be about criminal justice reform in Washtenaw County. And in particular, we'll try to have people talking about, did Steve just log off before we could applaud him?
He did. Yeah, that's okay. I told him he could go if he wanted.
Okay, I was gonna take everybody off of mute as we did at the end of the last. So everybody, I hope you can join us on July 17th. Go ahead and take yourselves off mute if you want to chit chat or if you want to sign off. Thanks for coming, and I look forward to seeing your faces or little boxes again.
Our little boxes. I think everybody should sign in with their videos.
Well, so go ahead and unmute if you'd like. Hi, Sarah. See, look at that. I can't actually unmute everybody.
Thanks, Sarah.
Unmute themselves. Hi, Sarah.
All right.
Okay, so Marie is asking if a recording will be available, and yes, it was recorded.
Bye, Mary. Thanks for coming.
And Mary wants to be on the email list.
I think it'll be posted on the league webpage. The league.
Email list.
Yeah. I don't know if